argument. Like I said, this is Lewis's famous argument in Mere Christianity. Unlike the other proofs, I'll say this right up at the top, there is a sense in which the skeptic can dispense with this particular condition called morality or right and wrong. However, it will come at a cost for him that should inform the Christian apologist as to tactics. Some people see where you're going in this argument, and they will say, fine, throwing babies up against a wall, or what Hitler did was perfectly fine. You definitely want to be in a large group of people when that's happening. Because though he may get out of the argument, he's just made himself a monster in front of hopefully a large group of people. So this is really a win-win kind of argument. No matter where they go at that point, you're in a good situation. Let's look at Lewis's direct argument. In the beginning of Mere Christianity, he starts by simply observing, sort of a common fact experience. He says, you look out at the world, we all have the sense of right and wrong. We all have this sense, and we can't quite get rid of it. This idea that we ought to behave in a certain way. He uses examples, and they're good, everyday examples. But he also says there's another fact, a second fact, and that is that none of us quite lives up to it. In fact, we don't. We break it every day. And this sense is of something that is so objective that it is worth calling a law or a principle, a rule of right conduct, and so forth. And when you get into arguments with other people about this, and I'm not talking about apologetics, I'm talking about everyday life. Somebody cuts off somebody in the road, and all parties make their appeal to this rule. And they expect other people to recognize it. Lewis very humorously draws this out, and very rarely does somebody simply say to the other person, to hell with your standard. They usually make up an excuse for why there was some special reason in this case why it doesn't apply to me. Or I have some excuse, I've had a bad day, or something like that. But all parties recognize the reality of this. Now, Lewis has to deal with some immediate objections. This is one of the great parts about the book, is that the second and the third chapter immediately start getting into objections. Like, Lewis, isn't what you call the rule of right conduct, or the law of nature, as you call it, isn't this simply, and I'm not going to do this in the exact order that he does, just because I couldn't remember when I was writing the notes what order he does it in. So first I'll tackle instincts. Isn't this simply our herd instinct that we have when we feel the need to act in a certain way, to not be unselfish, to help other people, and so forth? And Lewis says basically, I'm not denying that we have a herd instinct, but you'll notice that, first of all, if evolution is true, the stronger of the impulses should win out. But very often you're told to suppress that. But in general about suppressing, even more than that, there is not one of our impulses which the moral law may not sometimes tell us to suppress, and none which it may not sometimes tell us to encourage. He uses examples like patriotism, love of country, even the sexual instinct, mother's love for their child. You say, well, that's always good, right? Lewis says, no. There's a man's love for his country, or a mother's love for their child can at times lead to favoritism or mistreatment of other people, and so forth. Similarly, a fighting instinct or the sexual instinct must be called into action at certain times in their appropriate context, and so forth. And so when something is telling you to judge between these instincts, to suppress one and to awaken the other, the thing that judges between them, that which calls the instinct to be suppressed or to awakened, cannot itself be one of the instincts. And he draws a great analogy. He compares this moral standard and the instincts to a sheet of music and the keys on the piano. He says, essentially, the sheet of music is the law, and the keys on the piano are the instinct. And there's not a right note and a wrong note, but each of them are those motions of the soul that must answer to the right way that the sheet of music calls into fair play or unselfishness, and so forth. So that's the first objection. Could this be instincts? And Lewis shows why it can't. So let's write this on the board. Early objections. Can it be instinct? No, because there's none of our instincts that match what we're talking about here. Secondly, how did I get the dud again? Secondly, and again, this is not the order that Lewis, in fact, this is the first one he does. Social convention. Isn't what you call the law of right and wrong and so forth, isn't that just like driving on the right side of the road versus in Britain you drive on the left side? Even the steering wheel's messed up. Well, isn't that what we're talking about here? In fact, haven't people throughout the world in history had radically different ideas of right and wrong? Lewis says no. These are actually more like mathematical truths. And two reasons why. The morality of nations, first of all, as a matter of history, have not been totally different. They've only been slightly different. He uses examples. Nobody has ever admired somebody who's a traitor in war. Though you may use them, you don't see them as a virtuous character. He said men have differed on whether you can have one wife or two, but all of them have agreed that you can't just have any woman you want. And he uses other examples like that to show that these are different. Now, he really draws this out in another book, The Abolition of Man. But this is the way it proceeds in Mere Christianity. Second reason why it can't be just a matter of social convention is that the notion of moral progress and moral judgment is given up if it was totally relative. And so examples of that, he had a perfect example right in front of him in 1941. The Nazis. You know, you always hear that. Oh, the Hitler card. It's not a card. It's something that if your worldview is big enough, it ought to account for it. If it sticks out, your worldview is not big enough. And so Lewis goes right there and he says, well, the Nazis, they have to believe in the right in the law of right and wrong. And he says if they didn't know rock bottom that what they were doing is wrong, though we may still have to fight them, we could no more blame them for doing what they're doing than we can for the color of their hair. Right? It would be just deterministic and so forth. And so you can't judge between two nations, whether it's barbaric in the past and then has progressed, or England versus Britain during World War II. You couldn't judge between them if you did not have some standard, some third thing that you're judging them by. So just like the keys in the piano, Nazi Germany and the Allied powers were showing up like those keys. Same problem. You need a third thing that's doing the judging. Now, you can see at this point that Lewis's argument really depends on the other person agreeing that there is an objective right and wrong. But if he doesn't, you lose these things already. Two more objections of a larger naturalistic kind. That's why I just threw it in the bucket. This third one's not really an objection. It's more like a, let's just call it descriptive nature. So, for example, he keeps calling it the law of nature. But, you know, in the modern world, we know what the law of nature is. Like gravitation and so forth. This isn't really so much an objection, it's just something he has to say, no, that's not what I mean. If you take like the law of, so we say that a rock has to fall because of the law of gravitation, we're not saying that the rock suddenly remembers that it's under orders to fall. It simply does. In this sense, nature is only describing how the world happens to work. Whereas with human beings, you're dealing with something above and beyond that. We're dealing with something that says that you ought to behave in this way, whether you do or not. So it's not simply descriptive, it's normative. Last objection is the more evolutionary one, but actually, I don't know if it's a 4 and a 5 or whatever, but it's this. In this case, you could just say what pays off. And there I don't simply mean might makes right, although that can be a species of it. But isn't the moral law just human beings reasoning and seeing what happens to pay off in evolutionary history? It's the morality that pays, the morality that survives, and so forth. But Lewis says very often the moral law tells us to do something that does not pay off. It means doing things like telling the truth even though it makes you look like a fool. Saving somebody who's drowning even though it comes to danger to your own life, and so forth. Okay, so very often it's telling us to do something that does not benefit us personally. He draws this out with lots of different examples that makes it very clear. Now, what if the evolutionist gets more socially conscious and says that what is right is what is good? Why should we be unselfish? There's no mystery. It's what pays for society. It's what is good for society. Lewis replies again, but why should we care what's good for society except when it happens to pay me personally? If you're going to answer that, you have to assume a larger right. Now, what Lewis does is he shows the circular reasoning option of somebody saying, Why should I care what's good for society, except when it benefits me personally? Because you ought to be unselfish. And Lewis says, well, you've said what's true, but you haven't really gone any further. And he uses a funny example about if I asked you what football was, what's the point of football, and you say to score goals, you would have said what's true, but you wouldn't have gone any further. And I'm just saying that we ought to be unselfish, and that's the package that this comes in, is this obligation. Okay, so you move to the next step. He's established this. He's answered these objections. So what is it? If it can't be chalked up to these things or reduced to those things, what is it? Well, Lewis begins to make the case that this law exhibits attributes of personhood. Not meaning the law is a person, but meaning that it exhibits tendencies of preference, choice. He uses another buzz phrase. Just like in miracles, he used the buzz phrase interlocking cause and effect, and you really got to pay attention to that. In Mere Christianity, he uses the buzz phrase more like a mind than anything else we know. More like a mind. Now, he's also trying to kind of ease people into this. He's giving these talks on the BBC. He's got people skeptical of him, and he's already addressing it and reading their mail and saying, "Nah, I know you think I'm playing a trick on you, just trying to give you religion and all these different things." So he builds them up. Oh, boy. More like a mind, blah, blah, blah. That phraseology becomes very important. In other words, the idea is that somebody or something wants me to behave in a certain way. Seems to have a preference for good conduct against bad conduct. And so we can summarize Lewis's moral argument in the following way. I'm just going to cut right to the chase, so what happened in the last hour doesn't happen. I don't go too long. And I'm going to circle back and justify the steps. But let me give you the whole argument up front. So those are the objections. Get rid of those. This is one way to say it. I will say this. He didn't necessarily use all the words I'm going to use. And this has 10 steps, and I'm going to try to find a way to abbreviate it. And hopefully, if you get lost, you can always play it back. Oh, boy. 10 steps. First, all humans have the sense of objective right behavior. I'm going to put all have this sense. You already know what I'm saying because it's the first thing we introduced, right and wrong. That's where he starts, common experience. Secondly, no human beings live up to that standard of right. Should have said do it, up to it. Okay. That doesn't, and maybe not readily apparent why that might be important. Some objections might come into this like a Marxist objection. Well, that's what you call right and wrong is simply the invention of X class, whether it's a priestly class, ruling class of some kind. We'll deal with that, maybe. Third, no human is the source of that standard. Now that really has to do with all that he means by this, not the kind of thing we would come up with. If we did, we would come up with it differently. And there's reasons why that's the case, especially with respect to the Marxist objection. Hopefully I'll have time to address that. We can come back to it. That's another reason to write it on the board. Number 4, this standard, whatever it is, chooses, let's see, this standard, sorry for abbreviating this, but it won't fit otherwise. This thing seems to choose not just between good and evil, what we're calling right conduct and wrong conduct, but given those objections, and we answered them, it's over and above instincts, consensus, social convention, blah, blah, blah. We got to it in the objections. So this choice is something that's obviously over and above all of those things. Choice implies mind and will. And by the way, I'm completely aware, and if I was an atheist, I would say, wait a minute, you have not yet established this, which I'll come back to. But if let's just say, if this seems to be, this message that's coming to me shows choice of right conduct over bad conduct, that implies mind and will. 6, therefore, the source of this moral standard is... Add this to this, is a transfinite, uses that word in another book, mind and will. 7, such choice is of an objective right or good. You really do agree that this is right conduct. I'm just creating a map. I know I'm skipping all the words that I'm actually saying, but how else are you going to do this? Number 8, therefore this transfinite mind and will is also good and righteous. So there you have a mind that is good and righteous, in addition to being outside of space-time, outside of human convention, and so forth. Number 9, but mind, will, goodness, and righteousness, all the attributes we just mentioned, are attributes of a person. Therefore, everything I just said, an intelligent, good, righteous, transcendent person. Now, you could just say, we have the idea of right and wrong. We could have invented it. It had to come from outside of the system, whatever it is. It's a law, therefore it implies a lawgiver. And that's usually the way it's summarized, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with summarizing it. As long as you're aware, you're going to have to defend all the stuff in between those things you didn't just defend. That's the only reason I draw it out to this many points, just to give an idea. Yeah, I could say morality implies a moral lawgiver. Okay, and that's true. Every law written by an atheist has to assume that. It's called a law-legislation distinction, that in order to justify that a law is right and that its opposite is wrong, you have to appeal to a law that at least transcends that line of civil laws. So everybody believes in a law-legislation distinction, even a Marxist. I've argued that elsewhere. If you want to, on YouTube, The Law Above the Law, I did a lecture at BSU years ago, 6 years ago, that'll argue that point. So I have to appeal to other things that are not here right now. This is as far as Lewis's logic can take us, and frankly, I'm cheating a little bit. He didn't use all these words and necessarily in this order. But again, we're not here studying C.S. Lewis. We're studying morality in nature to learn something about God. Okay? So, all right. Where does Lewis actually go, though, if he doesn't summarize it quite like that? Well, he makes an argument that we have cause to be uneasy about the existence of a rule of right and wrong that is pressing in on us because we don't live up to it. Goodness is not at first good news. In fact, he even makes reference to some people kind of goofily saying that to meet the gaze of absolute goodness would be fun. And Lewis said they need to think again. They're still only playing with religion. Goodness is either the supreme comfort or the supreme terror, depending on how we've responded to it. And we have responded in the wrong way. Now, Lewis takes this more into an overall apologetic, and it leads to his exploration of Christ. But for our purposes, about the moral law, we're gonna work from this idea of goodness not being good news to other objections. I mentioned there's a Marxist objection against what right and wrong are. Namely, it's the invention of the propertied class to keep those guys down. There's a Freudian objection to right and wrong. We're projecting his same thing about God. There's a Nietzschean objection to right and wrong, and an objection from Ayn Rand about Christian morality. These are objections, they all believe in a kind of morality, but they object to Christian morality. And Nietzsche's objection and Ayn Rand's objection are almost identical. Nietzsche basically said Christian morality makes us all die. Rand's objection is Christian morality makes us all die slowly. Altruism. So not necessarily die all at once, but liquidate yourselves little by little or a lot, depending. It's the same objection that Nietzsche had, that Ayn Rand had. And we can talk about that after if you want to. But just because Lewis demolishes naturalism with the mind, as we saw in the previous session, and now right and wrong, that doesn't necessarily by itself show anything about the Christian conception of God. Lewis is aware of that. And so in the chapters that follow in Mere Christianity, he starts to do a little bit of comparative religion. In other words, okay, there's a source of good above the whole show, so to speak. But he writes a chapter called Rival Conceptions of God, because that doesn't necessarily settle what kind of lawgiver you're talking about or the source at all. So there's two levels. He compares monism and dualism. Monism, think of it as one-ism, all is one. Dualism, there's two ultimate realities, right? And so in this chapter, Rival Conceptions of God, he works on these two levels. The first division is this. He divides between those who believe in some kind of divine something, which Lewis says is the majority of people that have ever lived. And on the other hand, those who do not, modern Western materialists. Second division, and this is a very generalized, Lewis is well aware, in fact, he wants to make the point sometimes that people have believed in materialism in the ancient world too. Okay, but it's just generic. Second division between those who believe that this divine whatever is beyond good and evil, such as pantheists in Eastern religion. Evil may be an illusion. Reality itself is an illusion, and so forth. Versus those that say, no, God is good or righteous. He's not simply above it all in the sense that he doesn't care about good and evil, and much less that evil is an illusion. Evil is something that God hates. Okay, so at the next level of comparison, he has to take on dualism, because what he gets to with monism is the idea that evil is therefore an illusion, right? And so he gets then to the battle between Christianity and dualism, because these are two views that at least take good and evil seriously. But Christians believe that good is original and evil is a perversion of it. That's crucially important. In other words, if you didn't believe that, you'd be a dualist, not a Christian. Good and evil are not yin and yang or the Force in Star Wars or anything like that. Good is the original. Evil is parasitical. Notice I didn't say evil is an illusion. Some people get that idea when they think of the Augustinian view of good and evil. Oh, so evil is an illusion. It's darkness as opposed to light. It's nothing, absence. That's not quite what they're saying. Okay, so Christianity believes good is original, evil is a perversion of it. Dualism holds that they are equal and independent realities behind the reality that we see. So now it is something like Star Wars or yin and yang or something. But that's the key. It's not just two things. They're two equal and opposite things. Not just opposite, they're equal. They're both, in a sense, autonomous. And so what's the basic problem with dualism? Well, Lewis argues that you can't have two equal, autonomous, and ultimate entities. Because in reality, we call one good and the other evil. And we don't mean some personal preference by that. Oh, I'm on that team, the blue team instead of the red team. That's not what we mean by good and evil. Okay, so if evil was equal, we would see preference for evil acts for the mere sake of evil. Because we do see preference for good things because they're good. But Lewis says this is not the case. Evil acts are done to obtain good things only in bad ways. I think he uses the example of a bank robber. Think about it. Every time you do something evil, you're trying to obtain something good in to use Augustine's language, an inordinate desire, in a wrong way. Okay? But you can only grasp at something that's real, not at nothing. Right? So it has to borrow from good. So here, Lewis really makes his moral argument in a way that follows Augustine. Evil is a good gone bad. It's not nothing, but it's not being either. You see that? And so Augustine would use the word deprivation. We use the word depraved. But think of the word deprived first. Privation. Doesn't mean illusion. Think of rust in relation to metal. Moth holes in relation to a garment. So when you hear this is not, no, evil is nothing, good's the thing. No, evil is the thing going bad. Okay? So think of it that way. There's implications for the world. Not only is evil parasitic, but about the world, we live, Lewis says, in enemy-occupied territory. And down here, there may be the illusion of a perfect duality, right? And one argument that good is the original and evil is the parasite, is that we always measure what is bad by what is good. In fact, think about it. What do the words bad and evil mean? Don't they obviously mean not good? Or, and here's the crucial phrase, not the way things should be. We never measure good up to bad. Even when we lament that we don't see the good in the bad things that it took to attain it, we're still measuring both the good and the bad involved to some greater good. And so that's the clue, the way things ought to be. So morality here is made to rest in metaphysics. People separate these. They are distinct things, morality and metaphysics. But when we say, and I don't mean this in a funny way, even when presuppositionalists say, by what standard? It's a great question if you elaborate. But there has to be, when we say there has to be a standard, we mean there has to be a thing that you are saying that this thing doesn't measure up to, whether that thing's truth or a moral law or something like that. And in fact, Lewis borrows from Augustine. Augustine was really getting this from Plato. Goodness is being. Augustine elaborates on this in The City of God, that for God it's not one thing to be and another thing to be good, but they are one and the same. We'll get to that when we get to the doctrine of God, but and we get more into the attributes. But they can't be otherwise, because any standard for the way things ought to be has to mean some moral state, some moral existence that exists, that holds over all moral agents and over all circumstances. And so this state must be immutable and eternal. The good that you're comparing this universe to must be immutable and eternal. If it changed from one time to another, or if it had a different preference and called a different thing evil for one person than for another, well, then it wouldn't function for that standard over everything. Okay, so let's leave Lewis for a second, and now let's go to a transcendental or indirect argument. Notice, first of all, that the presuppositional approach that's so often called transcendent really has to start the same way as the classical approach. The apologist has to depend on his audience possessing some common notion of morality. So just take the formulation by John Frame in his book on apologetics. He says, as a matter of fact, we act and think as if these values were objective rather than merely subjective. Well, obviously the person has to know what you're talking about. What values, like don't kill or something like that. And then to the next step, Frame reasons, now where does the authority of the absolute moral principle come from? Frame says, notice I am not asking where the conviction itself comes from, as if this were a causal argument. You know, where did the origin of that guilty feeling for that thing you did wrong come from? He's not asking that. He says the question concerns the authority of the principle. In other words, what is the nature of its right to command? Its claim over us as moral subjects. That's the idea. And to get right to the point, absolute moral obligation demands two things: ultimate authority and personality. So, perfect place for it, right under this mind. If there's moral, these are commandments. I got a better one. These are moral obligations. Let's say you don't even hear anybody commanding you. Do this, clean your room, anything like that. But you sense it. That's what this represents. These are just different moral obligations. And what Frame is saying is that there's two things. Well, first of all, inherent even down here. Even down here, there has to be a person and there has to be an authority. However, if you're not talking about civil law or go clean your room in your own house, in other words, outside of transjurisdictional personhood and authority, as you trace that back, if there's going to be a morality that holds over all circumstances and all times, now you're talking about an absolute person and absolute authority. Because again, the question is how does that have legitimacy over all moral subjects? Now, when we canvass, just a couple of examples that come to mind of personal obligation, if you just think about some, we're never finally obligated to some material object. We're called on to do something, even a principle. Well, we're obligated to this principle. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Jesus and Confucius both agree on that one. Okay, I'm going to say it. By what standard? And he said, well, Jesus said it, and boom. And that gave Confucius's version of the golden rule an upgrade. Okay, that doesn't really answer the question. Why do unto others as you would have them do unto you? Okay, is it a material object? Well, obviously not. Is it the principle? These are only the mediums of moral exchange. Think about an example. If we owe a debt to a man who dies, great, we don't have to pay it anymore, right? Well, the necessity to pay it to his offspring, for example, is still rooted in his personhood and their personhood and their personal relationship between themselves. Atheistic philosopher Richard Taylor even recognizes this, and yet he denied such a person. He basically said, in order for these things to be really right, overall, there has to be some kind of absolute kind of authority and personhood. What did Taylor do, though? He denied such a person. And therefore, he went all the way denying objective moral obligations. And so I said, this is the other way you can go. You can recognize this and say, yeah, moral obligations, if they're ultimate, argue for this and can't exist without it. But I deny that. And then you have to go all the way and say, I don't have any criticism against Hitler now. So what is presupposed here is an absolute person. I won't get into whether it's presupposed or concluded. That, again, gets into apologetics class. Here's a short summary of this. I won't write this on the board because there's only 4 points, and they're simpler. So this is kind of the argument Frame was talking about. You can say it like this. Premise 1, objective morality exists. By the way, notice there, he's already starting with the assumption that we're all hoping that the person we're talking to agrees with this. Objective morality exists. 2, objective morality implies an authority sufficient to bind all moral agents under its law. 3, objective obligation, that implies a person to whom one is finally bound. And then 4th, therefore, here's the conclusion, the only possible source of moral obligations is an absolute person. And if Aquinas was ending that, he would say, and this everyone understands to be God. Okay, now, in other words, conceiving Lewis's arguments direct, Frame's arguments indirect, or any presuppositionalist, I think that's an oversimplification for a lot of reasons. There's another way, and I won't go into that because for time, but there's another angle on this, or at least there's another way that this could come up. Oh, good. William Lane Craig was on Ben Shapiro's show a couple weeks ago, months ago, whatever. He made a comment, and I think it's very instructive. Ben Shapiro asked him what he thought was a one-part question. He said, "What's the best argument? What's your favorite?" I don't remember what he said. What's your best or favorite argument for God's existence? And Craig said, "Well, the best argument's the cosmological argument, but there's a different question here. Which one is the most effective?" And that's the moral argument. Now, I didn't watch the interview, so I don't even know. I'm assuming what his reasoning for that is. But even if it's not his reasoning, other apologists have pointed this out. Is that, first of all, most people don't understand anything that's not political anymore, because everything about relationship and reality is reduced to power thingies, and people are really interested in talking about morality, public morality especially. I don't care about private morality, but public morality people are really interested in. And so the reason it's so effective is because you have a captive audience. People are already talking about it and want to talk about it, and it's easier to talk about. So I think that's what he would say, but I've heard other apologists say it anyway. So one of the ways that this could come up, and it's something that can just backfire for a skeptic, he's going to argue against God on the basis of the so-called problem of evil. So what is he doing? Is he trying to prove the existence of God? No, he's trying to do the opposite. Show that God doesn't exist because of evil in the world and so forth. And so this argument can actually be activated or initiated by the skeptic bringing in the problem of evil, which I prefer to call the problem of saying evil. for the reasons that we've talked about. Because at this point, the skeptic cannot say evil and mean anything cognitively, objectively meaningful. The Christian can. And so Lewis gives us a perfect representation of that in Mere Christianity. Let's call this the cardinal difficulty in criticizing God for X in the world, whatever X is. X could be evil, it could be suffering, it could be futility, it could be meaninglessness. And so you say, well, God doesn't exist because the universe is such a wasteland, or whatever else. Fill in the blank there. There's a problem. C.S. Lewis was pondering his own previous thoughts as an atheist, and he was basically saying, if a good God made the world, why has it gone wrong? Why is there so much evil and so forth? And Lewis realized that created a problem for me as I started to think about it. He said, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I gotten this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has the idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my private fancies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. Consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it had no meaning. Just as if there was no light in the universe and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never know it was dark. Dark would be without meaning. Those are the very things you need to say that God could not coexist with this thing. This is evil, and good could not coexist with evil. But of course, if good could not coexist with evil, then there's never been a point where evil and good coexisted, because it's impossible, according to your argument. But of course, if there's no good, then there's no evil, so there's nothing to compare it with. And of course, they wouldn't want to go the other way and say, because their whole argument at first tends to depend upon evil actually existing. So this is one of the problems, and again, not being a class on apologetics, I didn't even plan on covering this, the idea of atheology and the incoherence of atheology. You actually have to borrow from God's attributes to show why God's attributes are incoherent. Omnipotence would never, hold on. How do you know what omnipotence would or could do if omnipotence in principle can't exist? Because if it can't exist, it would never have existed. So how do you predicate anything to this thing that's essentially in the same class as a square circle or a married bachelor or whatever else? And so this is, in essence, the problem of saying evil. The words mean nothing in the mouth of an atheist. You need good to exist, and you need a transcendent goodness to exist if you're going to say that this evil doesn't measure up to it. Objections about, now I said before, okay, first I said, I shouldn't have left that on the board. Here we are, and this is why I did. You could say, wait a minute, where did he get this, though? I mean, I can see the rest of it, but where did he get this? That's why I kind of do prefer to argue that way. Lewis is giving popular apologetics, strangely enough, though, for an intelligent British audience at that time. So popular apologetics meant something different in the 1940s. But because of that, he wasn't drawing it out in a technical sense. Okay? So in this transition between Lewis's fourth and fifth point, or even, you could even attack 4 in and of itself, why say that this tendency and this rule that we all sense, that there's a tendency of right over wrong, why call that a personal preference? Is he cheating there? Is he smuggling that in? does this necessarily imply a choice in the cause of this tendency? Well, suppose we find that the standard always seems to exhibit a consistent pattern. Why infer a preference from this? Well, part of this is going to have to wait till next week when we get to the teleological argument. This is where Thomas is going to help us complete this argument in a better way. Lewis's argument's fine, but at least it'll deal with this objection. The nature of tendency or even design is already implied in this claim, and the objection is sensing this. And we can see how the moral argument seems to be borrowing at this point from the teleological argument. And so morals are inseparable from meaning. The question is whether we can entirely reduce this idea of meaning to the subjective. Is there such a thing as objective meaning, and is that necessarily the case in the universe? So that's where I'll leave it there. And what do we do on time here? Better, anyway. I personally, last thing, I personally don't find, going back to Craig's statement, I find the moral argument I don't want to use the word weakest about this because I think it's powerful. I find it to be the of the 5 groupings or others that you can add, I find it to be the least logically airtight. I mean, for examples like that, you have to borrow from other arguments. We'll talk about that idea of borrowing from other arguments next week. Oh yeah, common notions. Well, we'll talk about that next week too. So here's where we're going next week real quick. The last of the arguments, the teleological argument, the arguments from design or end or tendency, that's the first section next week. And then we're going to do a wrap up. It's more than just like a leftovers. It's going to be very important. So I'll leave it at that.